We live in a world of a million voices screaming for our attention.
You can do, Judge.
Use, and
Judge,
they say
hold on.
You're changing.
People will tell you what to think, where to go, who to listen to, even what to believe. With so many voices in our world today, don't you think it's God's turn? During God's Turn, you'll hear practical truths from God's Word for our lives today. Dr. Daniel Stevens, the senior pastor at Grace Baptist Church in Anderson, Indiana, presents powerful truths from God's Word for your life. In a world of a million voices, it's time to let God speak. Join us today for God's Turn.
We all like to look back and reminisce. We like to remember the days gone by, and really that's a good thing for us in our life, to take time to remember what God has done for us, remember where we have come from, remember those times with family and friends that we've had in the past. Christmas time is one of those times where we often remember when the kids were young and opening up their presents, the excitement of traditions and those sort of things. It's a time to remember. Oftentimes sights and sounds or maybe even smells cause us to remember, or a memory will come up into our mind. You know, we set up dates or milestones to help us to remember. We have things like birthdays where we look back on birthdays of old or on our childhood or our youth. And, you know, sometimes we get birthdays, we stop having birthdays, right? We don't want to have birthdays. You know, sometimes people have a birthday and it hits them hard. You know, it's amazing to me. People say, oh, 30, that one hit me hard, or 40 hit me hard, or 50 hit me hard, or 110, that one really got me. I mean, you know, or whatever. But, you know, I've never had that issue. 30 was fine. 40 was fine. My assumption is 50 will be fine when I get there. You know, it is what it is. And I'm grateful for the years the Lord has given me. Anniversaries are a time of looking back. You know, when you have a wedding anniversary, you look back on the life that God has given you. And we set up things like Memorial Day in our country to remember those that sacrificed and given us the freedoms that we have in our life today. Graduations, weddings, those are times of remembering. You know, when your child graduates from high school, and it makes you look back on their life, and when they were just, you know, going into kindergarten, and you remember that day when, you know, they wouldn't let go of your leg and they were crying and didn't want to go into school, and now they're ready to run off and leave and go, and what the next stages of life might have. Weddings, your son or daughter getting married, causes you to remember and to look back. We often use pictures to remind us. For most of us, it's social media now. It pops up, right? Reminds you where you were on this day 4 years ago, and that picture that you posted, or 7 years ago, however long you were on or have been on Facebook. You see those memories pop up, and they cause you to remember, and that's a good thing. You know, it's something that we should do spiritually as well. In Joshua chapter 3, God had just allowed the nation of Israel to cross over the Jordan River. And we come into Joshua chapter 4, and the verses that Kevin read, God tells them to take up 12 stones and prepare to place them there in the Jordan River. They're going to get over on the other side in verses 19 and following in Gilgal. They're going to set up these 12 stones. And God tells them that, in verse number 6, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean ye by these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over, and these stones shall be a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. If you look with me at verse number 19, and the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and encamped in Gilgal in the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, when your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean these stones? Then ye shall let your children know, saying that Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan from before you, until ye were passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up from before us, until we were gone over. that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. Oftentimes it's good for us to look back. But today I want us to first stop and look back, and then transition to looking forward. It's good to look back, but it's not good to stay there. We have to turn and begin to look and eventually move forward. As we move into chapter 4, we said God had him set up these memorials. There's a memorial set up in Geneva, Switzerland, in a lake that has an inscription that says, "When you read this, weep. Someone carved this because when the water gets this low in the territory is in drought. When you can read the words, then cry, because the country is in trouble." The memorial there in Jordan could actually be the opposite. Someone could have written upon this, "When you see this, rejoice and remember." Occasionally the Jordan gets very low, and the Israelites were able from time to time to see these 12 stones that were there in the middle of the Jordan, and it was to recall the great things that God had done for them in their history. It was a time for them to remember and recount and to think about all that God had done for them in their life. And as we think about the nation of Israel and we see them, or these stones, or these memorials, first of all, it caused them to remember. It caused them to remember who God was and what God had done for them in their life. And it caused them to bring their attention back to the fact that they only were where they were because of all that God had done for them, and how He had led them out of Egypt, and how He had led them in the wilderness, and eventually He brought them across the Jordan River onto dry land. And so this memorial was set up for them to remember, because we often forget. I think about the nation of Israel. They come out of the land of Egypt. They're there in the wilderness, and they're grumbling and murmuring, as people often do. And they go to Moses and they say, "Why did you bring us out of here? Was it not better in Egypt? We had food to eat." I can picture Moses. If I was Moses, I'd be, really, was it better in Egypt? Stop and think about it for just a moment. Was it better when you were a slave? Was it better when your taskmasters were beating you? Was it better when you had to work, and if you didn't do enough, you wouldn't get your food? Was it really that much better in that situation? Think about it for just a moment. What God brought you out of, what He brought you through, and where He's brought you. Not only was that memorial set up for them to remember, but it was also set up as a teaching tool. We should all have memorials in our life that remind us of what God had done for us. You know, there's certain dates in my life. You know, think about June 9th, 1995 was a big day for me. It was the day that I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior. And each year on June 9th, I think about where I was in 1995. I think about the setting and the people that were around, the circumstances of my life, and how I came to trust Christ on that day. That's a memorial for me in my life. It reminds me. Many times we look back with pictures with our children, and we are reminded of those old days that were so great. And your children look at those pictures and they think about, "Did you really wear that, Mom? What was your hair? What were you doing with that hairdo? What is going on back in those days? What were you thinking back then?" The truth is their kids are going to look back on their generation, and they're going to say the same thing. What were you thinking with those clothes? But as we look back, we can teach them about a different time and things going on in life, and we can teach them about God, how great He is, and how blessed we are. But looking back on these memorials also gives us an opportunity to honor God. See, when they were to teach their children, they weren't just to teach them about the circumstances of life and the struggles and trials and difficulties, but they were to teach them about God and to lift up His name and give Him glory for all that had been done through the nation of Israel. How God had promised them this land back to Abraham. And how God blessed Abraham and his family and brought us into Egypt, and how we grew as a nation, as a people, and then how God brought us out of slavery in Egypt and how he crossed the Red Sea on dry land. And we can teach them about all the good things and all the blessings that God has given us in our life. You know, this is something the church should do at times. That time. And I look at our church now, where we are, and how God has blessed us physically with our facilities. He's blessed us financially, and I'm so grateful for that, to have the money to do the things that God has called us to do and to invest in our facilities and all those type of things. In the years past, we would not have had that, but God has blessed us tremendously. But man, more importantly, spiritually speaking, I'm so grateful for many of the things from our ladies' Bible studies, our equip classes, people coming and joining, and just God has done great things here in our church. And it's important that we don't, forget about what God has done for us, and that we remember, where we came from. A lot of times when we think about history, we think about it from the leadership standpoint. You think about, Moses and Joshua and all that they did. You think about the pastors of the church. But the truth is, countless individuals have invested in the ministry here at Grace Baptist Church, some of whose names I will never know. But they sacrificed and gave and served, and now we have the wonderful blessing to take part and receive the fruit from their labors. And I love looking at old pictures of the church and the ministry. And listen, there's always a time for that. And God set that up for the nation of Israel. There's a time for you to look back. But I want you to see and understand today that we see in Joshua chapter 4 that there's not only a time to look back, but there's a time to look forward. Look with me at verse number 10. For the priest, which bare the ark, stood in the midst of Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord commanded Joshua to speak unto the people. According to all that Moses commanded Joshua, the people hasted and passed over. And it came to pass, when all the people were clean passed over, that the ark of the Lord passed over, and the priest in the presence of the people, and the children of Reuben, and the children of Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh passed over. Notice this, armed before the children of Israel, and Moses, as Moses spake unto them, about 40,000 prepared for war passed over before the Lord unto battle, to the plains of Jericho. On that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of the Lord. God had set up these memorials and said, listen, you need to look back and you need to remember and you need to use these to teach your children about all that I've done for you and all I've done for the nation of Israel. And as they passed over, we see first and foremost, they didn't just sit there and they weren't just satisfied with being there in Gilgal. They weren't satisfied with just crossing over the river. The Bible tells us that they crossed over and they were prepared for the battle. They were prepared to move forward. And it's so important for us in our walk with God and in our life and as a church that we don't just sit around and look back and think about how great things used to be and how they were and think about how God has blessed us. But we have to realize we still have a responsibility. We still have a battle to fight. We still have a job to do. And we have to turn now from looking back and start looking forward. As Israel crossed over, the Bible tells us that they crossed over and they were ready for battle. They crossed over realizing that they had a task at hand. And I can picture, Joshua and Caleb, who were two of the spies. 10 came back and gave a bad report, and 2 came back. Joshua and Caleb, and said, yeah, listen, the armies are big and the people are big and it's going to be a difficult task. But listen, God has promised us that land and God is going to give us that land. And I can picture Caleb and particularly crossing over, and now they're there in Gilgal. They set up the memorial and they said, okay, guys, we've looked back, we've honored God, but we still have a job to do. God has promised this land and we are going now to take it. And so now as we transition from looking back at our church history, we need to look forward. And we realize here in these verses, first of all, they were in a different place. They were in a different place. They no longer were in Egypt. They no longer were in the wilderness. Now they were in the land that God had promised them. This was a place they had not been. This was a place that was prepared for them, but they had not been there. They didn't know the lay of the land. They didn't know what they were getting themselves into. They were in a different place. Listen, we as a church are in a different place than we ever have been in our history. This isn't 1960s Anderson, 1970s Anderson. This isn't in a few weeks, it won't be 2020 anymore. It'll be 2021. And listen, we live in a world that is different and the landscape is constantly changing, but our responsibility is the same. We are to go into the world and make disciples. Our responsibility is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our responsibility is to invest and make disciples, teaching people everything that we know, everything that we've been taught, everything that we learned, we're to pass on to others. We so often look at our world and say it's a terrible place and it's hard and difficult and we have a virus and we don't like the president and we don't like Congress and we don't like this and that and we have all these excuses. Listen, the world is different than it might have been when you were a child, but God is still on the throne and God is still alive and He has still commissioned us to take the gospel of Jesus Christ into this world. We often look at society and we look and we make excuses. That's what they did in Israel. We're grasshoppers in their sight. There's no way we can go and take the land, and they suffer the consequences for their disobedience. But now they're in a different place. We also see that they're in a different time. The older generation has passed on, and now the younger generation has crossed over into Jordan. And listen, we live in a different time today in our society. Things are constantly changing and maybe they're getting harder and it's a struggle. And so often we use these things as an excuse. Why we are not doing what God has called us to do. Well, I can't share the gospel with people because I have to social distance. I can't share the gospel with people because I got to stay home. And listen, there's really nothing I can do. Oh, well, let's fold up our tent and go home. Listen, the church has faced obstacle after obstacle after obstacle throughout its history. They've had to adapt and change and figure out how they were going to fulfill the Great Commission that God has given them. And so we have to do the same today in the times in which we live. The times are always changing. The times are always different. But the responsibility is still the same. We see they were in a different place. They were in a different time. Centuries had passed since they went into Egypt. Decades had passed since they were wandering in the wilderness. But God's promise was still the same. This was your land. And so we see here that when they crossed over, number 3, not only were they in a different place, a different time, but we see that they were still ready to fight. They were still ready to fight. 40,000 prepared for war, passed over before the Lord, unto battle, to the plains of Jericho. They were ready to come across and they were ready to go and take the land. They were ready to do what God had told their ancestors to do and what God had expected them to do all along, to come into the land. I can picture again Caleb there encouraging the troops. Listen, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. I understand this, but God is going to go with us. And listen, I want the mountain. I want to go and I want to fight and I want to take this land that belongs to us. I want to go and I want to serve. I want to give. Greater than I ever have before, I want to do the work that God has called us to do. And the church needs to stand up and say, listen, it's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult, but more than we ever have before, we want to serve God and we want to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. They were ready to go out and they were ready to fight. And we see they were ready to move forward. They were ready to move forward. They didn't just cross the river and pitch their tent. The Bible tells us here that they went out there to the plains of Jericho. They went out to conquer that land, and so they come to that first city to fight and to conquer and to move forward, following the plan of God. But we have to make sure that we're following the plan, following the command that God has given us. So many have gone by the wayside and not followed the plan and committed to the plan that God has given us and the purpose that He's given the church. Israel went off to fight Jericho. And as they come to Jericho, God had given them a plan. It wasn't the plan that they necessarily would have conjured up, but he said, you're going to go and you're going to march around the city. You're going to march around the city today, and then tomorrow, and then the next day, and then eventually you're going to march around the city 7 times, and then you're going to fight. No, you're not going to fight. You're going to shout, and you're going to scream, and you're going to holler, and the walls are going to fall down. And what happened? They fell down, and God gave them the victory. They got a little full of themselves for just a moment. Oh, we're going to go to Ai next. Oh, just send a few people. We're good. It's a small city. We find that 30-something people were killed, and they had to retreat because they quit following God's plan and seeking his direction. They got off on their own way. Joshua gets before the Lord, and God gives them the plan, and we see them getting the victory over Ai. We see them moving forward, following the plan that God has given them. God did not call us as a church to sit around and reminisce and look back. He called us to reach the people of this world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And our responsibility is to go forth and fight and move forward, finding ways that we can share the gospel and reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our job is to go out into this world and minister and serve and show and proclaim the love of Christ. We have to make sure that we stay focused on the plans that God has given us. Israel, as they went into the land, as they went to do the task that God has given them, they found themselves in a different place. They found themselves in a different time. They found themselves ready to fight and ready to move forward. 2020 was difficult for the world. It was difficult for Christians. And many have stopped serving and gone by the wayside. Many have made excuses why we're not doing. Many churches have shut down through all this. Now, as we move into 2021, we have no idea what we're in store for. We have no idea what's up next and what's going to happen. We hear people say that by the summertime, things are going to be back to normal. And you hear people say by 2022, things are going to go back to normal. We really don't know. We really don't know what the landscape of the world is going to look like. But we know that God is on the throne and he is in control. And we know that he has given us a command to go and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to a lost and dying world. I enjoy looking back and remembering all that God has done for me in my life. I enjoy studying the history of our church and talking with people that have been here and, hearing names of people that I'll never meet or that passed on to heaven and their role and impact on the church. I get excited to hear those things and to learn and to remember and just to be reminded of the goodness of God. And how he has blessed us individually, how he's blessed us as a church. But I realize that God has placed us here. And now it's time to turn and to look forward. Look forward to the days ahead of us that God has given us. Look forward to the opportunities that lay before us. And we could be the children of Israel that wound up wandering in the wilderness, doing nothing for God because of their fear, being content with being there, wandering. Or we can be the people that cross the Jordan River, ready to fight, ready to do battle, ready to serve God, ready to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. The world is filled with turmoil and strife, and people have a great need. Not a need for a vaccine, not a need for stimulus money, but a need to have their sins forgiven. A need to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's our responsibility to stand up and go and fight and serve and preach and teach and help people come to know Christ as their Savior. That's the church's responsibility. And we must now turn and look forward to this next year and to the year after, if the Lord tarries, or until He comes back or takes us, and must constantly be ready to fight. As you look over the next pages, Israel goes on to fight. And they get parts of the land. And one thing you'll realize very quickly as you read through, they don't possess the whole land because they get complacent and get content. And listen, it's easy to do that in a church. Oh, we've grown and we have money and we have things and look at our facilities, how beautiful it is. And it's easy to become complacent because, oh, we've done this and look at all that we've done for Christ. But don't forget, there's still more to do. There's still more to conquer. There's still more preaching that needs to be done. There's still more people that need to be reached for the gospel of Jesus Christ. This last year, have you made excuses why you haven't told anybody about Christ? Has there been anybody that you influenced with the gospel of Jesus Christ? Somebody that came to Christ because of your ministry? Have you seen somebody grow in the Lord and been discipled because of your influence or in their life? People have gone to church because of your influence on their life. Or have you made excuses? Have you been content with just going through life and doing your job and going home to your family? What's 2021 going to look like? Have you made a commitment that this year I'm going to tell people about Jesus Christ? I'm going to find ways and look for opportunities to share the gospel. I'm going to do everything I can to disciple people and to see them grow in the Lord and maybe get involved and serve themselves. And I'm going to do everything I can to fulfill the Great Commission. Have you made that commitment in your life? You see, sometimes we look back on our life and we see the greatness, things we've accomplished, things God has done in our life. Sometimes we have to look back, and if we're honest with ourselves, we see our failures. We see where we've been lacking. And those should be times that we use to motivate us to look forward and say, we're never going to let that happen again. I'm going to do more, and I'm going to invest more, I'm going to sacrifice more, I'm going to quit making excuses, and I'm going to step up and do what God has called me to do. We want to thank you for joining us for God's Turn. We trust the message was a blessing to you. If you have any questions about what you heard, or if we can help you in any other way, please call or text the church office at 765-643-7853. If you'd like to hear more messages like you just heard, or you'd like more information about our church, visit us at gracetoanderson.com.
God's Turn is a ministry of Grace Baptist Church. We'd love to see this program continue to reach homes across Indiana. Would you consider giving to our ministry? Go to our website at gracetoanderson.com/give to give online and designate your gift to God's Turn.